welcome to this week's episode of the Goodrum Show with me, Chris Goodrum. Okay, this afternoon, as you can see from the title page, we're looking at American whiskies, and specifically we're looking at the Chicago-based Koval Distillery. Now, the reason there's a bit of an oddity going on with the bottlings in the Koval range. There's only 4 bottlings, and as you know, 4 swallows do not make an episode of the Goodrum Show, or something like that anyway. So originally I was intending to taste it against the Hudson Bay bottlings, or 2 of them anyway, produced by Tullatham Spirits, and because I thought, very similar kind of setups and ideology, and then I sort of realised, in actual fact, I'd done the Hudson Bay bottlings on 2 previous episodes of the show, and I'm not the world's biggest fan of them. They fall into that classic trap, I suppose, of American start-up distilleries that basically matured their spirit in small 30-litre casks in order to kind of get the maturity sort of quickened up, and thus you can get your product to market quicker. And the big issue I had with this kind of practice is that the oak feels a little bit unnatural, insofar that yes, it certainly imparts a lot of vanillins and a lot of colour, and takes away some of the impurities, but there's no substitute for time in essence, and a lot of the time you get this kind of like Mari sort of young spirit character coming through, which sometimes isn't too bad, but when it becomes a bit too intrusive, it's just sort of like, no, I'm not really enjoying this, and the kind of, from memory, the Hudson Bay bottlings kind of fall into that, and I was a bit suspicious about the Koval bottlings because they follow exactly the same production methods. But the distributor, Amethyst Drinks, the rep, basically said, no, give them a try, they're really, really good. So I thought, yeah, okay, I'll certainly give them a try. I'm always open-minded, even about stuff that I don't particularly like. As you well know, I'm always willing to give things a second chance, and sometimes, maybe I make mistakes, maybe it's just not a good day when I taste something and I don't particularly like it, and then I'll come back to it, and I find that in actual fact I was probably being overly harsh on that particular whiskey. But anyway, so I had a bit of a quandary. What do I stick in place of these 2 Hudson Bay bottlings? And I thought, well, I've had these 2 bottlings that were produced by Bartles Whisky. They were bottled sort of tail end of last year, and I've had them sat around since Christmas in actual fact, and just haven't had the opportunity to put them into an episode of the show. So I thought, well, bugger it, let's just stick them in today's episode of the show. Yes, there's no link between the 2, but aside from the fact that they're both American spirits, I suppose. So anyway, like I said, today's episode of the show is really focusing on Koval, and the distillery was established in 2008 and was the first distillery to be built in Chicago after Prohibition. And it was founded by a couple of brothers called Robert and Sonat Birknecker, who I don't know quite what they did prior to that, but apart from they had academic careers, so probably lectured in something or other, I guess. And they apparently I think they're Austrian, and they have a sort of family background in distilling, and decided that they wanted to sort of try and do something in a more traditional manner. They didn't want to just go and buy spirits from other distilleries or other producers and just maybe age them for a bit and then bottle them or blend them and bottle them under their own label. They decided they wanted to do everything proper, as they say over here, and the terminology, I believe, is grain to bottle, which I find really, just so it's craft and all that kind of stuff, it really sort of gets to me a bit. But anyway, the concept was that they basically wanted to buy grain as locally as possible, organic. They wanted to mill it and produce everything on site, so from sort of milling, making the wort and distilling, everything was done on site at the distillery. And the interesting thing is, if you look at the name Koval, apparently in several Eastern European languages it means blacksmith. But which doesn't, I don't know why they mention it, because it bears no relevance, I suppose. But apparently in Yiddish it means black sheep, which is now more understandable insofar that they were considering themselves black sheep of the American whiskey industry at the time. I mean, now it's de rigueur to sort of do all of this kind of grain to bottle kind of stuff. But back then it was something quite new, it has to be said, for a sort of a start-up distillery anyway. And so basically that's pretty much it. The one interesting thing about Koval is they don't just use the sort of standard corn and rye for their bourbons. They also use millet as well, which is quite interesting. And they also bottle individual, so you've got a rye, a millet, there's a 4-grain, and there's a bourbon. So they're doing some interesting things, and I always applaud distilleries that do try and do things a little bit differently. But at the end of the day, as we well and truly know, it's what's in the bottle or in the glass, as the case may be, and the quality of that's what counts. All the frippery surrounding it can be absolutely meaningless if your product isn't particularly great. So anyway, let's have a look at today's lineup. Okay, so we're going to kick off and do the 4 Koval bottlings to start off with. We're going to start off with the rye. Now, another interesting thing about Koval Distillery is these are all single barrel bottlings, so these are all 30-litre bottlings. So you're talking what? I mean, I don't know, handful of bottles really at a time. So anyway, so the rye is 100% organic Minnesota rye, aged in new small 30-litre barrels, bottled at 40%, and this one is barrel number ZH4AZA. Talk about odd numberings, but well, there you go. The second bottle we'll be looking at is the Millet. So this is 100% organic Midwest Millet, again bottled at 40%, and from barrel number XHOL09. Okay, I wonder if they were sort of mathematicians possibly and sort of love all this and playing around with numbers and letters and what have you. Then we're going to look at the 2 bottlings that are bottled at 47% as opposed to 40%. The first one is the 4-grain, and this features oats, malted barley, wheat and rye, so no corn. Yeah, kind of interesting. And this comes from barrel 8UZA3A. Hope you're following this. The final bottling of theirs we should be looking at is the Bourbon. So obviously, being a bourbon, it has to have 51% corn, which it duly has. But in this case, instead of using rye or wheat or something like that, they've opted to use millet again, so 49% millet. This comes from barrel WU2D35. So I think that's going to be quite an interesting little selection. And then the 2 Bartles Whisky bottlings we'll be looking at in their Big B brand, and quite smart looking bottles in actual fact. I was quite impressed. This is the first one is a 2-year-old. Yeah, 2-year-old. Of course, whiskey can be bottled, at any particular age. 3 is the usual. But of course you can bottle it at lower than that, which they've done. And this was distilled in 2015. It's an Indiana bourbon, so again I imagine sort of 51% corn and 49% others. It's bottled at 46% and was bottled, like I said, tail end of 2017. And the last bottling we'll be looking at is a Tennessee. Well, they said bourbon, but I think it have to be Tennessee whiskey in actual fact. This was distilled in 2003 and bottled in 2017, so 13 years old, which is actually quite old for an American whiskey, as we said. I mean, you don't tend to see a lot of them get beyond 6 or 7, it has to be said. I mean, yes, there are some exceptions to that, as we well know. And this is bottled at cask strength at 53.7, and it didn't come from the Jack Daniels distillery, so there's only one other logical place it could come from. And as I might have mentioned last week, there seems to be an awful lot of Dickel sloshing about on the secondary market, and This should be pretty impressive, as we said. 13-year-old George Dickel. I mean, yes, it's not cheap. It retails at about £85 a bottle, and that kind of gives the game away that it's on the shelves. So anyway, so's the Koval in actual fact. So there you go. I've just kind of given that one away as well, haven't I? So, but anyway, we shall see what these bottlings are like, and we're going to kick off with a bit of rye. Okay, so Koval rye. Let's see what the nose gives. A lot of oak. It's big. It's chunky. It's dark. It's spicy. I mean, I love the sort of soft spices of the rye and the slightly grittier spices of the oak. Yes, it feels relatively young. I mean, I don't know exactly how old this is, but I'm guessing it's not going to be a great deal older than 3, 4, maybe 5 at the very most. But it doesn't have any faintiness. There's no sort of off the stilly kind of notes. And it's got a nice kind of grip to it, it has to be said. And it's all pretty well balanced. The oak doesn't feel particularly unnatural. It does have a really nice kind of rounded character, and that rye is really sweet, or becoming sweeter, I should say. Absolutely lovely, it has to be said. I mean, that's one of the wonderful things I find about rye. It can often be quite sweet and spicy, or other times it can be really hard as nails, and you know, that kind of intensity. And this certainly comes into the sort of sweeter end of the rye spectrum. So, on nosing, I'm impressed. Let's see what the palate's like. Again, quite a lot of oak, big, chunky, vanilla-y oak, and again, it kind of kicks off with the sweeter rye kind of notes before moving into the more grippy, spicier rye on the mid palate and on the finish. But it's lovely balance. There's a touch of treacle, a bit of dark chocolate, a very subtle violety note as well, and I'm not getting any Mar notes as well, so it certainly seems to, in this case, the aging in small barrels has certainly worked, and they've obviously left it young enough to at least get some kind of you know, oxidation character, aeration, and just to remove that kind of youthful edginess, shall we say. So I think that is really impressive. I like that. It's full flavoured and soft and subtle, and yeah, really well balanced. So nice start. About the Koval bottlings is they're not particularly expensive. Yes, they're bottled in 50 cl bottles, which, you know, does make them, I suppose, if you put them into sort of 70 cl bottles, would make them a damn sight more expensive. But you know, I get what I'm retailing them for, to be honest with you, but they're not that expensive. Anyway, let's move on to the Millet. It's got a real sort of oiliness, a real pungent, oily, almost kind of, I mean, if I was tasting this blind, I would have swore this was wheat. It's got that kind of wheat, flaky kind of character, but there's a bit more of an oiliness to it that I don't normally tend to find with wheat whiskies, and yeah, that's really interesting. It's got more intensity. There's more crispness. Yes, it's still the same sort of level of soft oak. And there's almost a sort of slight corny sweetness as well. Obviously there's no corn in it at all, but obviously sort of Millet is quite interesting. It obviously sort of apes some of the characteristics of corn and of wheat, and it's got a lovely darkness, a lovely dark chocolate, almost kind of coffee note, a little bit of almost like kind of tea leaf, sort of tea leaf, maybe cigar, tobacco kind of notes. Yeah, this is really quite intriguing, it has to be said. And if any of you that watch the show that are coming to the 4th of July tasting that we're having, you'll get to taste this. And I like this. I think this is really interesting. It's got just enough of a sort of a weird edge to it, but not too weird, if you see what I mean. I like this. This is impressive. Let's see what the power's like. Again, it's edgy. Tastes a little bit younger on the palate than the rye. Again, it's got that oiliness, that sort of tea leaf stroke, sort of tobacco leaf kind of character, almost kind of ashy sort of feel as well. Soft spice, soft oak. But yeah, that's got loads and loads of character, and I really like that. I think that's really impressive. And like I said, it's got enough oddness, shall we say, to make it interesting, but not too much oddness to make it sort of like a Corsair, for example, where you go, good God, what the hell is that, kind of thing, you know. Made out of pumpkin seeds or some kind of weird stuff like that. But no, it's certainly, I think it's got a really interesting character, and I'm all for a bit of interesting character. Right, okay, so let's move on to the 4 grain. Like I said, this is oats, malted barley, wheat and rye. Let's see what the nose gives us on this. Well, straight up you get the oats. It's got that oaty kind of porridgey sort of aromas, and there's a little bit of slightly dark spiced rye, and a very subtle, very subtle kind of wheat note as well. Again, not as heavily oaked as the rye. Probably sort of the oak is sort of about the same sort of level of intensity as the millet, and but it's got a lovely dusty spiciness, almost kind of nutmeggy, cinnamony sort of spice. Touch of violet. The rye is starting to come through a little bit stronger. But again, it's showing a bit of a sweetness and a bit of a spiciness. I think this is really complex. This is very good. Yeah, I like this. This is impressive. There's even a bit of almost kind of column stilly kind of dried fruit, sort of verging on the sort of rummy. This is obviously oxidation character. So, like I said, I think this has obviously spent a little bit longer than just 3 years in the cask, and yeah, this is quite rounded, quite appealing. I really like this. Let's see what the palate's like. Well, that's a big spicy finale, that is. That rye really comes in with loads of sweet but slightly bitter spice as well. Quite a bit of oak as well, got some lovely sweet vanilla. Not getting so much from the wheat, it has to be said, on the palate. It definitely kicks off with a noticeable oatiness. And a sort of, you know, kind of softness to it, and then in comes the rye, and it's all kind of spice and sort of, you know, a bit of a sort of like a bit of a lad, shall we say, and that is an intense finish. I mean, yes, the additional level of alcohol from 40 to 47 certainly kind of seems to do that to rye. It seems to sort of just increase that sort of, you know, emphasise that spice element, and oh, that's impressive. Okay, and so on to the last of the Koval bottlings. This is the Bourbon, so it's 51% corn and 49% millet. Let's see what nose gives us on this then, shall we? That's interesting. I'm getting definitely a lot of the millet character. It's got that sort of oily, almost kind of sweet rye-like kind of character. The oak is not the oak. The corn is not too sweet. It's not too fat, and it's certainly kind of playing second fiddle. I mean, you certainly feel the corn beneath the millet character, and again, it's got a lovely depth to it. Like I said, you've got the millet, you've got the corn, you've got the oak, and they all seem to be sort of like layered, and that is lovely. That is a really, really lovely nose. It has to be said. So much character, and really well balanced. Again, kind of softens up a little bit the more you leave it in the glass, and certainly leave it to sit. If you give it a bit of an aeration, you certainly get that sort of real oily kind of millet character coming through. But nice and earthy. Let's see what the palate's like. That's intriguing. A little bit more oak, a little bit more corn character to kick off with, but you can just feel the sort of the oily millet kind of just at the edges, and it starts to sort of encroach as you start to get towards the finish. You get the spices coming through, and that sort of almost kind of wheaty-ish sort of note as well, that sort of wheat flaky kind of character. Again, some lovely mouth-watering spice, and like I said, it does kind of have a sort of almost kind of rye kind of finish to it, and I certainly wouldn't have guessed that had millet in it at all. It has to be said, if I was tasting that blind, I would have sworn that it was just your kind of classic sort of corn and fairly heavily rye mash bill. So yeah, really impressed with that, and like I said, they're on the shelves in Shea Gauntly, and like I said, if you're coming along to the 4th of July tasting, you'll get to taste one of them. So, right. Right, okay, so 2-year-old Indiana Bourbon. I'm going to get a nose full of faints and stuff, I imagine. So anyway, let's. But no, I'm preempting, which I shouldn't do. So let's see what those good is. Yes, it's Mari. It's quite corn fat. There's marzipan, almonds, a bit of burnt toffee. Just got real intensity. I mean, yeah, all right. It's not sort of your soft sipping kind of bourbon. It has to be said, it's a kind of not quite sort of Knob Creek and grabbing you by the throat, but it's got some real intensity. It has to be said. It's relatively simple and straightforward. It doesn't retail for an awful lot from memory, although I'm a little bit out of stock of it at the moment. But you know what, I kind of quite like that. It's very cereal. It's very young. It's not too edgy, if you see what I mean. Yes, there is some Mari kind of notes. There's a little bit of almost kind of sweet Parma violet. I'm quite surprised at how much complexity it actually does have for being a 2-year-old spirit, and like I said, I like the bottling, I like the bottle shape, I like the labelling, I like the presentation, and I mean obviously that's not a consideration when you're tasting it, but certainly from a retailing point of view it certainly is. But I like this. Kind of goes against the grain, I suppose. Oh dear. Anyway, let's see what those give us. The palate gives us. Yeah, youthful, young, bit Mari, bit of rose petal, bit of almost. I don't know if you remember, those of you that remember refreshers. It's got that kind of tingly sort of refreshers kind of character, or also a little bit of Parma Violet as well. So some fat corn. The spices are really quite intense as well. It's got a lovely youthful character, it has to be said, and you know, you would have thought it might be all a bit disjointed. You'd have the oak over here, the other characteristics all bouncing around, but it actually feels pretty well integrated. It has to be said for a 2-year-old. I mean, you know, I'm impressed. It has to be said, and I love that spicy finish. That spicy finish is really, really nice. Again, it's, you know, more at the bitter end of the rye spectrum than the sweeter end. Hence why it feels a bit more edgy and a bit more sort of, you know, that kind of thing. But you know what? I kind of quite like that. Let's have a bit of old Dickel then. Let's see what those gives us on this. Oh, that's lovely. Mature oak, baked apples, a bit of marzipan, a bit of chocolate. Oh, that lovely old rye kind of character, and you know, it is old as far as American whiskey goes. You know, given the how quickly it matures, and oh, that's stunning. There's a little bit of treacle, bit of toffee, bit of cinnamon, violets, touch of corn, but yeah, that rye is sort of like got right there and really quite intense. And that's one of the things I love about Dickel, is that as far as I believe it's a relatively high rye mash bill, and certainly comes across like that. Really quite earthy, mellow. Oh, that is just stunning, absolutely stunning. Little bit of caramelised orange coming through, sort of almost kind of moving into a marmalade-y kind of direction. I mean, this is just one of those sort of whiskies that you keep sticking your nose in and something new kind of crops up, and oh, you got to love that. That is really impressive. Oh. Let's see what the palate gives us. Kicks off with sort of dusty rye spices, a bit of pepper, but it's kind of softened by that sort of slight treacly kind of note. There's a little bit of tobacco, baked fruit, cinnamon sticks, bitter chocolate. It is quite bitter on the finish, in actual fact, it has to be said, but it's got that lovely rye kind of spicy, bitter, chocolatey kind of character. But the oak and the treacle and the soft corn notes kind of just about give it enough of a balance. You can taste that that's got some maturity. That I wouldn't say the finish has kind of gone, but it is a little bit shorter than what you would probably expect. But in saying that, it is just wonderfully luxurious. It's wonderfully intense, and it's got a lovely mouth-watering character, and considering it's 53%, it is so easy to drink neat, it has to be said. I mean, I'm assuming that I don't think I've actually got no water in there. I'm assuming that sort of the alcohol is kind of like sort of just chopping the end off a little bit, but oh, that is bloody good. Right, okay, so let's sum today's episode of the show up. So firstly, a very, very big thank you to both Bartles Whisky and to Amethyst Drinks for the samples for today's episode of the show. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the show if you're watching, which I know they probably will be. And well, you know, I was really impressed by Koval. Like I said, I had tasted the Bourbon a few years ago, and it was okay, shall we say. And maybe they're just maturing the spirit for a little bit longer now. But anyway, the rye, I loved the rye. I thought the rye was really, really intriguing, and it had that lovely combination of sweet rye character and spicy rye character, and I was absolutely spot on. Sometimes, being bottled at 40%, it can be a bit, but I thought that was pretty impressive. The Millet, I liked the Millet. Like I said, it had enough of a kind of a weird kind of character, but not too weird, and lovely oiliness, and certainly sort of had a kind of almost kind of pseudo rye character, if you like, I suppose. And I thought that was pretty impressive. I liked that. The 4 grain, again, a very, very good bottling, and certainly seemed to it wasn't too young. It certainly seemed to have the right amount of age to it, and certainly you've got the characteristics of the main components. I mean, yes, all right, there's a bit of malted barley in there, but the reality is that in American whiskies, the malted barley really is only there to kind of kickstart the fermentation. You very rarely get kind of any kind of characteristic from it, because both the corn and the rye tend to be sort of quite, not overpowering, but they tend to be sort of a little bit more dominant. And the Bourbon, yeah, I kind of liked that. I thought that was interesting, and it was nice to see, something other than sort of just corn and rye, to be honest with you. And I thought the Millet kind of worked really, really nicely with the corn. So yeah, can't complain about that. It's very rare that I'll taste an entire range of a particular company or distillery's bottlings and say, yeah, I like all of them. But certainly in the Koval's case, I do. I think I like them. I know I like them. And the 2 Bartles Whisky bottlings, yeah, again, yes, the Indiana Bourbon could have been sort of horrible and overly youthful at 2 years old, but in actual fact, surprisingly drinkable, and with enough kind of complexity to sort of make it interesting. Yes, relatively simple. But like I said, enough complexity to sort of make you go, yeah, okay, that's intriguing. And the Tennessee Bourbon, or Tennessee Whiskey as the case may be, yeah, I like that. I mean, that was lovely, mature, Dickel, basically. Again, sort of like plenty of rye character and plenty of oxidation, maturity, really quite impressive. So yeah, I think, and certainly a really interesting episode of the show. So anyway, that's this week's episode of the show coming to an end. Next week I've got yet another first, and I'm pretty certain that it's certainly going to be a YouTube first anyway, but anyway, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. Anyway, so that's this week's episode of the show in the bag. I hope you've enjoyed it. All that's left to say is good afternoon and good Dram. Oh, and I hope England win tomorrow. Well, they should bloody well do, shouldn't they? Anyway, till next week.